This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair.
And this is Allison Dickson of the Vintage Villains podcast.
This is the second in a series on the 1979 disappearance of Christina White, a 12-year-old girl who disappeared in Asotin, Washington, a small town on the Snake River in the Lewis-Clark Valley near the Washington state and Idaho borders. Christina was last seen at her friend Rose's house a few blocks away from her home. It was the day of the Asotin Fair, and Christina's mother said she had gone to Rose's house to help Rose prepare her horse for the fair. Rose lived in the house with her 10-year-old brother, Clint, his mother, Patricia Brennan, and her mother's boyfriend, Lance Voss. Clint reported seeing Christina that day and said that Christina became sick and called her mom Betty, a fact that Betty would later confirm to the police. Clint said he handed Christina a wet washcloth to help her cool down and that no one else was home. However, Lance would later tell investigators that he had handed Christina the washcloth and was the last one to see her. Christina seemed to vanish without a trace until somewhere between a few days and a few weeks later, the reports conflict. Pristine school papers of hers were found miles away at the Flynn farm where Rose kept her horse. Investigators and Christina's parents conducted ground and aerial searches and crossed the Pacific Northwest looking for clues from carnivals to cults. Nothing. That's until almost 3 years later, on June 26, a 22-year-old University of Idaho student named Kristen Noel David disappeared on a bike ride from Moscow, Idaho to Clarkston, Washington. Kristen's story is where we're going to pick things back up. Not long before this point, where investigators begin to wonder whether they have a serial killer on their hands in the valley. Kristen was known to be thoughtful, free-spirited, interested in a wide variety of things, from art to politics. She had previously worked at a Circle K grocery store in Clarkston at the time when Lance Voss worked as a delivery driver for Frito-Lay companies. Voss also, as a part of that job, frequently took trips to Moscow, where David also worked at the Scorpion Bar, which David's sister said would later say Lance Voss also visited. There's another reported connection between Voss and David. Kristen was said to have worked sewing costumes at the Lewiston Civic Theatre, where Voss performed as an actor and would later become the janitor. Kristen headed south on Idaho 95, but never made it to Clarkston. We're about to hit the Koberger map again in a second. Early in the investigation, multiple individuals traveling on Highway 95, the one that Koberger took south, by the way, on the day of David's disappearance, reported seeing a female cyclist matching her description being approached by a man driving a brown van on the west side or southbound side of the highway just outside of Gianese, Idaho, where Brian Koberger also took a left on the night of the murders and turned.
Wow.
So additional reports suggested that the same man they saw then also spoke with or approached different female cyclists or pedestrians along Highway 95 that same day. The location's about 17.4 miles north of Lewiston and about 15 miles south of where Kristen was in Moscow, Idaho. So on July 4th, 1981, so we're in late June when Kristen disappears. On July 4th, 1981, Kristen's dismembered remains in black plastic bags began to be discovered by fishermen in and along the right bank of the Snake River. And so the Snake River heads east at that point, so the right bank is the northern part of it. and among other places, just off the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge, which connects or which runs across Clarkston and toward Idaho, even though right where it crosses, it's still Clarkston technically. So some, but not all of her remains were recovered the next day in the river. Some of her body parts were wrapped in various April 1981 editions of the Lewiston Morning Tribune. So we're in
Mm.
July. Her body parts are found in plastic bags, but they're wrapped in the April in different editions of April 1981 copies of the Lewiston Morning Tribune. In total, 5 bags were found. The newspapers certainly pointed to somebody who was in or frequented or was near the Lewiston area sometime between April and July of that year. Others would later report that a man was seen throwing trash bags off the north side of the bridge, which is located about 1 mile from the unusually circular domed house that Lance Voss owned about a
Mm.
mile to the south.
You don't say.
No, and so it's about half a mile from Christina's reported destination also, the Dome House. And so one interesting thing that was police holdback evidence for a long period of time, but eventually some of the autopsy details slipped out, was in Kristen's skull, according to a autopsy report in August of that year, were metallic fragments that indicated that she had been shot in the head. And in a letter to the county coroner, a pathologist wrote that he thought she had died of a single gunshot wound to the head that was delivered from the front at a downward angle, shattering her facial bones. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, and the only injuries appeared to be 2 bruises on her upper left buttocks. The pathologist reported that they found little blood in her body and almost no internal organs, and that Kristen was dismembered quite skillfully at the joints, with only a couple of areas where they saw bone damage. Sperm was not detected in a vaginal washing and swabs. Toxicology reports were inconclusive, but they did find she had a little alcohol in her blood. And I personally discovered one truly interesting fact in the autopsy report for Kristen. The pathologists say he was convinced that she was shot with a bullet that was 2 millimeters in diameter.
2 millimeters.
Yeah, not 22 millimeters, 2 millimeters in diameter. And that would be like an exceedingly rare caliber weapon. A bullet is described based on its diameter, the circular width at its widest point. And then there is a 2 millimeter, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but I'll go phonetically, but colibri was the smallest commercially available centerfire cartridge, and it was patented in 1910, introduced in 1914 by an Austrian watchmaker, and designed to accompany the colibri semi-automatic pistol or single-shot gun. So it has a gun with only 1 bullet in it, and it was marketed as a self-defense weapon. Colibri comes from the German word for hummingbird. The round was totally not well accepted. The gun's small size made sort of like handling and loading individual cartridges really difficult. So the gun, by the time we're at Kristen David's murder, is more of a collector's item with only about 1,000 ever produced. So
Wow.
that's a heck of a clue. So, as would become a bit of a theme in these cases, Kristen's case was tossed from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, including multiple counties and the FBI. A psychological profile of the killer was developed that suggested that it was more likely than not to be a white male in his 20s or early 30s who would have marks or bruises from the attack, drove a brown van, and potentially had souvenirs from the murder. Just like Christina, Kristen's 10-speed bike was nowhere to be found, although they did find the handlebars eventually. Her clothing, identification, and shoes were never found. So what we're going to find is it's very similar to the Diane Taylor story, but we'll get to that soon enough. some of Kristen's jewelry was recovered.
Yeah, I find it so interesting about the bicycles. The Snake River Killer podcast points out that Voss had a thing for bikes and motorcycles. He was a bit of also a gearhead. And as we'll find as we go through this case, and it starts to become a little more apparent that he seems motivated by the idea of trophies and stuff. It's almost like a signature. And so it's interesting that these bicycles just don't turn up. And it is interesting though that there's only the handlebars that were recovered from Kristen David's bike.
And as we walk through these cases, we're going to find out a lot of IDs disappear.
Yeah, and remember too. Oh geez, I had a thought in my head that just vanished. That happens. But there were, I saw this in one of the documentaries. I know we didn't make mention of it here in the outline, and I think it's because it ultimately was irrelevant because the documentary Cold Valley brings it up. I'll mention it here. Wasn't there a witness that claimed to have seen somebody that had been like a woman and a man on the side of the road, and like somebody had been hit by the bicycle, and there was somebody had been hit on the side of the road that had a bicycle.
Yeah.
And they saw somebody with the van, but that person was under forensic hypnosis when they delivered that statement.
Well,
right?
But there are several people who saw a man in a van approaching an assortment of people there.
Gotcha.
But the reason why that one sticks out is the idea that the handlebars could have been damaged in it. So that's why they point to that one, that it could be separated. But I tend to not put a lot of weight on that because someone dismembered her skillfully.
Yes.
They can cut apart a bike.
Absolutely. Right? And I mean, and automatically I'm thinking when they say skillful dismemberment, that's somebody who's very practiced at it. It's not their first rodeo.
Right. It simply means you're not hitting bones along the way.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, like a good butcher,
Yep. And so one of the real problems I think in her case is that, you're on the edge of the Idaho border. You're on the edge of the Washington border. Mm-hmm. You have like 4 counties that are coming together in that area. And I think that, and then she's from Moscow, disappears in another county in between, or is last seen. You've got a Native American reservation right beside there. And Oregon is not too far on 129, the route on the edge of the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge. So you've got a lot of different things. But one of the things that sort of sticks out to me about this is this ad that Voss placed in the newspaper.
Oh, geez.
A very curious ad about a German Shepherd being found on an address in Snake River Avenue. And it was about 1 year after blonde, blue-eyed German David's body was found.
Right.
And with a German ancestry.
This is part of the pattern, by the way. We're establishing a pattern here by mentioning these classified ads. He liked to do that sort of thing.
So the next sort of step in this is on the evening of September 4th, 1982. So a year after Kristen David disappears, 35-year-old Stephen Purcell, a janitor at the Lewiston Civic Theatre, began working at 6:30 p.m. His girlfriend Carol picked him up around 9 p.m. for them to go to a party. Around midnight, Carol later reported that she dropped Stephen off so he could go do some laundry at the theater and he could practice his clarinet. He didn't have a laundry machine at home. So Stephen was last seen by a police officer who happened to be in the area that night, entering the theater from a side door on 8th Street, which I have a picture of here. It's so the top right side, that's off of 6th Avenue. That's the into the side of the Lewiston Civic Theatre, which the front door is the bottom side, and the back will become relevant momentarily. So the police officer sees Stephen enter on the same evening at about 9:15 p.m. So before the midnight drop off, at about 9:15, two stepsisters began to make their way to a local Safeway grocery store. Christina, or Christy Nelson, who was 21, and Brandy Miller, who was 18, were last seen leaving Nelson's apartment to go to the store. They had started at Brandy's apartment, or Brandy had started at her apartment before they went to Nelson's nearby apartment, and they left a note for Christy's boyfriend saying where they were going. So both of the stepsisters knew Stephen Parasol, who at this time would still be at the party and not have returned to the theater. And all of their apartments are really, really close to each other and close to the theater. So Gloria Kroboberts, Christy's cousin, says that her family members said that Christy and Brandy saw Stephen as a big brother. Christy had previously worked as a janitor at the theater. Stephen was currently doing it. When she quit, Stephen replaced her. So that night, Christy and Brandy never returned home, nor did Stephen. So his clothes were never found, the ones that he went to do laundry. His clarinet was found in the main theater, but the case was never found.
Which is so weird.
Yeah. So I think an important thing to think about is the timeline here. At 9:15, the girls leave to go to a Safeway, which is like, less than a 10-minute walk away. They don't return. But then at midnight, Stephen goes to the theater and he doesn't return either. And so at first, law enforcement wondered whether Stephen may have been somehow responsible for the disappearances. Having three people in the town really close to each other disappear at the same time is a bit odd. But some clues came together over the years, including the fact that Stephen hadn't been heard from. He hadn't tapped into any of his resources. He left his car at a friend's house. He didn't pick up his final paycheck. All these things sort of suggest that Stephen is dead. And eventually on March 19, and here's a key part of 1984 and a tragic part, the remains of Christy Nelson and Brandy Miller were found by a 14-year-old boy who was chasing his hat. It had blown off of his head in a rural area about 35 miles east of Lewiston near Kendrick, Idaho. And the investigators were unable to determine the cause of death for Christy, but they were able to determine that Miller had been murdered. She had been strangled. And investigators initially suspected Stephen, but later stated that all three had probably been in the theater that night at the time that they disappeared. And the clue that really pulled it together, which I'll go ahead and say now, is that cords were found wrapped around Christy and Brandy's body. They had been restrained by cords, and those cords came from the theater.
Wow.
So now that we know they were in the theater, they went to Safeway, somehow they made it to the theater. And if you believe that Stephen Parasol had nothing to do with it, the picture that starts to emerge in your head is that the girls leave with no intention of going to the theater, somehow end up at the theater that night. And,
would they have walked past the theater on the way to the store?
You could, but probably not. It would have been a little bit out of the way, enough out of the way. But what you would have, we'll get to what you would have walked by, but probably not directly by the theater. There are two ways they could have gone.
Okay.
But this would have, the other way that didn't pass the theater would involve much less climbing uphill. So, and they were known to go through this park that would have gotten them there. But one of the really interesting things to me about the timeline is that if they leave at 9:15 for roughly a 15-minute walk to a Safeway, and somehow they end up at the theater, right? The theater that Stephen left at 6 p.m. to go to a party with his girlfriend. So Stephen's not at the theater. Let's say they go to Safeway, takes them 15 minutes to get down there. They spend 15 minutes in Safeway, 15 minutes there. You're somewhere in between 10 and 11 p.m. Yeah. And Stephen is definitely not back yet at the point where they disappear. Now, they could have been hanging out. They could have been doing whatever. But that window, he's not there. But at some point, they end up in the theater, and then unexpectedly at midnight, Stephen shows up. And that part of the timeline, if you believe that Stephen wasn't involved and he was also killed, suggests that he walked in on them while they were being abducted.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Christy and Brandy were not dismembered like Chris and David. The police now believe that the killer kidnapped Brandy and Christy, or either directly kidnapped them or convinced them to go to the theater for some reason, somewhere between Safeway and the theater. And so a way to describe it is the theater is on a big hill in Lewiston, and you go down the road on that hill, and you've got a corner with something called the Red Baron Pizzeria. And if you take a right before, you'd run right into the Safeway.
Okay.
And so, you know,
Mm.
some of their clothing was missing. Once again, identification was missing. Christie's coat and jewelry, including an opal ring, were found on the scene. So again, jewelry is still there. Identification is missing. Some clothing is missing. 2 coin purses were found, but not their main wallets or purses.
Interesting.
So underwear and shoes of both women were missing. And that could have been predation. Having been to this hill, what it really felt like in looking at the map of the old road is that someone drove their car to the guardrail, tossed the bodies off the side, and it has a very, very high sloped angle. So where it goes, you cannot get to that space easily. So someone really just tossed the bodies over the side there. Gloria and I went out there with her dog Cash, and you can't climb up from the bottom of that hill to where the tree is without serious help. So it was with all the trees and the hill, it was an excellent place to at least in my mind, to toss a body. So back on the night of September 14th, 1982, we know some of Lance Voss's timeline because 3 days after the disappearances, he walked into a local police office and volunteered a statement.
Which is so interesting. Well, he kind of needed to in a way because, and we'll explain that in a second. So Voss told the police that he had been watching the movie The Fog at the Red Baron Pizza Parlor, which was down the hill from the theater and right across from the Safeway grocery store, as Jason explained a moment ago. He told police that the movie ended at 11 p.m., although local TV guides said it ended at midnight.
Can I pause here for a sec?
Yeah.
So just to say, we have Nelson and Miller go missing somewhere after 9:15 p.m. We have Voss saying that he watched a movie at the pizzeria that's between Nelson's apartment and the Safeway.
Yeah.
And that it ended at 11 p.m., even though the local TV guides say that it ended at midnight, which I think is a bit of a red herring rabbit hole that people go down to, because if he's saying the movie ended at 11 p.m. and he stopped watching it,
yeah,
that still puts him in the jackpot time between where the girls go missing and Stephen walks into the theater. What 11 p.m. really does for him is he's not near the time if the girls left at 9:15 when they would have gone missing.
right.
So, we don't know whether he watched the movies. We don't have witnesses to say that he stayed through the TV guide. But what we do know is that if you believe he watched the movie until 11 p.m., there's a very low likelihood he would have run into Christy and Brandy.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. And that fudging of the time just kind of seems convenient. I mean, he was there. He was at the building right between it. You can just almost imagine if he was sort of hanging out around there Maybe outside. Do we know if he smoked or anything like that? Maybe he was outside having a cigarette. The girls were
Well,
walking by. I mean,
and
you
remember
know?
also part of what he says next is that he at 11 p.m. he leaves and he goes to the back to the theater and he falls asleep.
Mm-hmm.
He says that he's working on the rafters and he hurt his back. He was in pain and he fell asleep on the couch. So the beauty of that is the beauty of 11 p.m. is it's not near where Christy and Brandy would have disappeared on a short trip to Safeway. And it's
Right.
also puts him asleep when Stephen Parasol works. So
Aha.
11 p.m. is just perfect. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time in this case focusing on the movie really ending at midnight. But I tend to think like it's a bit like Israel Keys. You can sit around and you can wonder whether Israel Keys is telling you the truth about this or that. Like, stop. Just stop.
Yeah.
Just assume it's a lie.
Right.
And what does the lie serve? The lie, 11 p.m. is perfect. It is the perfect time to not run into either of these parties and enough
yeah.
time to end up asleep.
And he had a time over 3 days to figure that out before he goes in to give his statement. It's like he was getting that timeline for himself worked out. And as we'll see here, because it gets even kind of dumber as we go along from him. But anyway, he said he returned to the theater after the movie and moved his car from the front of the theater to the back. And if you're on YouTube right now, you can see pictures of where he parked his car behind the building. And there's a small loading dock back there that led to a room where costumes were kept, and he intended to get some tools out of there. Voss said he was planning to work on some rigging, and he had twisted and strained his back during that process. He mentioned physical injuries, cuts and bruises from the accident. So apparently he was kind of beat up a little bit by whatever happened, according to him anyway. When asked, Voss said he did not notice Stephen come into the theater at midnight. If the movie had ended when the TV guide said it did, it would make sense that Voss would not hear Stephen return, but not if it ended at 11 p.m. At some point, Voss said he heard the phone ringing, but did not pick it up. He told police that he decided to lie down and fell asleep until 5 a.m. and woke up in the green room of the theater and noticed nothing unusual. Voss said he left for home, but realized that his wife, Patricia, had to go to work soon and he did not want to wake her. So he went back to the theater. This is all very strange because you have to wonder, what is Patricia thinking at this point? He hasn't been home all night, you know?
If you were to believe that, what happened that night is 3 people disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Voss went back to the theater, injured himself. I mean, his timing was perfect. Injured himself. Wait, hold on. Moved his car from the front of the theater to the back of the theater, which is that picture on the left where you can see those back doors that lead to the bottom.
Where there is a loading dock.
Yes. And so, and for reasons unknown, moves his car to the back of the theater, and someone gets into the theater and kidnaps Stephen Parasol. Someone had either, you also have to believe that someone also either stole those cords from the theater and used them somewhere else to tie up the girls, or had the girls in there and came in and broke in and tied them up. So you got to believe a lot of wild things to think that Voss noticed nothing.
Do you think his claimed injuries happened during the commission of the murders?
Could have been.
I just feel like he threw his back out. He had some cuts and bruises on him. I mean,
that's exactly what I was thinking. It could be a great excuse for that. You got to believe a lot of strange things for that to happen. And, one of the other things, Voss at the time had a relatively small car, which points away from him taking 3 bodies away and dumping them. But that part of the story always has bothered me about him saying that he said he heard a phone ring, but he didn't pick it up, slept till 5 a.m., woke up in the green room of the theater, noticed nothing unusual. But then he goes home, he says at
Mm-hmm.
5 a.m., and then he returns. And
Yeah.
it really makes me wonder that if I had a small car with not enough room for 3 bodies, maybe what really happened is far before 5 a.m., I drove and I dumped either 1 or 2 of the bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And then I returned, and at 5 a.m., I went by my house or something along those lines. Or I went back to the theater. I need an explanation returning to the theater where I pick up the last body and then dump it. And one great thing Brandon points out in the podcast that I think is just really in the Snake River podcast, at that time, or I don't know if Brandon points this out in the podcast. I think he does, or it was either on the podcast or on his blog. It's not like today where you can take your credit card and go to a gas station and get gas in the middle of the night. So
Mm-hmm.
also another thing is that 35-mile trip to Kendrick and 35 miles back, whoever it was may have needed to get gas
Yeah.
before completing all of their work.
It is mind-blowing to me that he was not investigated further
Yep.
with this, given where he was in the circumstances. How was he not zeroed in on? And I this just blows my mind. I mean, the circumstances here are just overwhelming to me. Like, this is the guy they should be zeroing in on here. Instead, people were treating Stephen Pearsall, who was by all accounts a very gentle and kind and, very good person, did not have the temperament that anybody would ever just suspect. I mean, people just couldn't believe that they would even think him a suspect in this thing.
Well, I see
But
that's what made Stephen a suspect was in retrospect, Stephen, when they visited his apartment, they said that there were some what they quote unquote deviant things there. All right, sexually deviant things. Not sure what they mean by that. I've never gotten the details on that. But what people have told me who are close to the case is Stephen was probably asexual.
yeah,
And so his lack of sort of like sexual interest in people and possibly lack of having sex with his girlfriend made people think that he was some kind of sexual deviant, the investigators at the time. And so that's what put a focus on him. In our lens of better understanding people now, I don't think we would have had that same immediate focus on him.
that's a good point. So strange things continue to occur here. Within the next year, they found a men's watch dangling from the rafters above the theater room, but Stephen's family was unable to confirm whether it was his. Around the same time, Christie's wallet was found beneath a Frito-Lay vending machine in an academic building at Lewis Clark College, in a building where Stephen Pearsall had attended classes. Here we go again. I know we're thinking about Stephen Pearsall attending classes there, but I'm just thinking Frito-Lay.
Uh-huh.
Although Snake River Podcast was like having trouble verifying a lot of those employment records, but again, at this time in the 70s, paper records, yada yada. I used to work for Frito-Lay. It's actually pretty high tech now. But anyway, 3 days after Christy and Brandy were found, Voss was brought back in for an interview about the night that they had disappeared. Over the coming weeks, he was interviewed several times, but he refused to take a polygraph. At this point, the police inform him that he is now being interviewed as a suspect. So he was being looked at closely now at this point. They just weren't able to pin it on him. In May, Chief Fredrickson confirmed there was a suspect in the disappearances and deaths at the theater and says that he is being looked at for homicide in another jurisdiction. Voss continued, however, to live a relatively normal life. He continued to volunteer at the theater and work a wide variety of jobs, none of which he seemed to be able to easily hold down. He was a former member of the United States Navy, and he has a pretty lackluster record. Let's just get that out of the way. So it kind of fits a pattern that, Voss just sort of is this sort of jack of all trades, master of none, doesn't really want to focus or kind of pin down on any one thing. But he was elected as a trustee around this time for the local Veterans of Foreign Wars organization, which is just funny because the man was very nearly dishonorably discharged. It's kind of amazing he wasn't. But anyway, we'll talk more about his Navy life later. He becomes a little more active in politics as well, frequently writing letters and continuing to publish weird little classified ads. So on Christina White's birthday, Voss published an ad in the Lewiston Morning Herald that said, quote, "Lost, March 3rd in the Osoton area, brown husky, phone number 758-9422, and then another phone number, 243-4284, and then comma, eves and weekend." So he provided 2 phone numbers, another missing dog ad. It would have been Christina White's 20th birthday.
Can I pause for a second?
Yeah.
Who has evening and weekend phone numbers?
Yeah.
We know that the first phone number is his home phone number. Can't figure out who the second number is, but like without having a weekend phone, who has eves and weekends? But go on.
That is it. Right. Exactly. It would have been Christina White's 20th birthday. In addition, the letters for Christina can be found consecutively in the ad. The letters for the name Christina. It is a 9-letter name with its letters consecutive in an ad that only has 11 words. The syntax in the ad is so strange, especially for the way classified ads were written. And I also found this very interesting because I did have a job writing classified ads back in the day, and they do follow a particular format. So I wondered like how it got past the editorial.
Well, I can tell you
stage.
on my end that if somebody fights you to death on a classified ad,
That's true.
You're going to get it in whatever way they want. You're just not going to recommend. You're going to tell them like you're wasting your money or.
I actually do remember having a few of those conversations. Yep. Good point. No. But there aren't many brown huskies. Anybody who's ever seen a dog, they're kind of usually gray, black, and white, a little mottled. Maybe you'll have one with spots of brown, but that's not typical. The first number can't be linked to Voss, but the second phone number can be. Furthermore, if you unscramble the numbers after removing Christina, you can come up with 7 years now. Voss's first and last name can also be found in the ad, but not consecutively. It was 7 years from Christina White's death or disappearance.
What a coincidence.
It is wild. And you can see a lot of these ads too, and I mean, also, if you want to see a huge treasure trove of pictures, and I'll have a link to this too, go to the snakeriverpodcast.com site. Strand and them have put on a great bunch of pictures and evidence there. So,
yeah.
But yeah, the classified ads just really, again, we've talked about this offline, about like how, this is a taunt. This evokes things like Zodiac and, BTK
and sort of like there's an alternative version of this, right? Which is that one, Lance Voss committed these crimes and is sticking it in everyone's face through classified ads. Or the other version of it is Lance Voss did not commit these crimes and is still sticking it in everybody's faces. So it could be both, but
he's messing with people. Yeah.
But then I keep thinking about how many people in my life, I was the last person to talk to them before they disappeared. Yeah. And it's all about 0.
Mm-hmm.
And
same.
Yeah. And I'm older than Voss was at that time. So, and I think I hung out probably as a kid with a lot of drug dealers and a lot of, criminals. So you would think I would be, but no.
Yeah. And this keeps happening to him. I was watching earlier a YouTube video from That Chapter channel on this. He did a brief little video on it, and he said this guy is like the Forrest Gump of murder.
Yeah.
That he's just always there at the moment that something like this happens, and it's just. But this particular case for me just feels like, he was a strong suspect, and yet he just managed to slip out of their hands because he wouldn't take the polygraph. And then he shut down and refused to answer questions. And I guess they just didn't feel they had enough to hold him on.
Yep.
I don't know.
And he was slick. Like he was being investigated in the Spokane serial killings. And, he agreed to give his DNA in that case, but it could only be used on those cases. None of the other cases.
Interesting.
So it takes us to July 27th, 1987.
Yes. We have another tragedy, and this time from 24-year-old Claudette Voliva.
It's
Uh,
Viola. It's spelled wrong in there. So
oh, Viola. Okay, gotcha. A registered nurse and a girlfriend of Lance Voss, who was still married to Patricia, by the way. She was found dead in her apartment. Her death was ruled suicide by overdose, according to a copy of the medical examiner's report. She met Voss at the Lewiston Civic Theatre during a production of Footlight Frenzy. Voss arranged her funeral services, and she was buried in the local Normal Hill cemetery. So yet another dead girl.
body showing
Mhm.
up around this guy. So
Yeah.
I'm going to dive a little bit into Lance's background. So these are not the first time Lance Voss has been in the close proximity to or a suspect in murder investigation. Lance was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1947. The family, after his father Frank died, they moved to an apartment on Linder Avenue in Chicago. It's about 12 miles west of the Loop downtown. In 1962, he started attending Austin High School in the Austin neighborhood of Chicago. And he was involved in like music, enjoyed spending time in the library, two things that really stayed consistent over his life. Voss was also involved at the local YMCA in the Austin district, where he worked as a counselor. So he's about 15 at this time. And this would be the first time that we know of that he was caught up in a murder investigation. On August 1, eight-year-old Diane Taylor had been attending a day camp at the YMCA and asked Lance to unwrap a lollipop for her, according to two witnesses to the incident. He refused, and the witnesses said Diane kicked him in the shin. Diane was last seen around 2:10 p.m. in an alley behind the YMCA building, just after the shin-kicking incident. Diane's mother returned home around 6:30 p.m. Diane was not home. She reported her around 9 p.m., 9:30 p.m. to the Chicago Police Department. 2 days later, Diane's naked body was found in an alley on Lockwood Avenue in Austin Heights. So there were houses on both sides of the alley. These are really long, wide alleys that ran between the houses, and she was found in the grass behind a fence to one of the yards. She had been stabbed, had head trauma, was sexually assaulted. Stab wound to the heart was believed to be the fatal blow. Some investigators believe that an axe and a knife had been used. Her blouse had been shoved down her throat. This location happens to be between the house where Lance grew up and where he worked as a counselor. The blue shorts Diane was believed to have been wearing were missing, as well as her blue wallet and her YMCA ID.
Yet another missing ID.
I know. I
Interesting.
have a feeling this case is going to be solved by somebody finding a box of IDs. So
Yeah.
the alley had been searched before. So detectives believed that the location she was found in was a disposal site and that it had been dumped on the previous day. So Voss lived about 3/4 of a mile north and to the west of the dump site, virtually between the YMCA building and his home is the site. So in a newspaper clipping, and I'll show you guys the newspaper clipping.
Oh, this is interesting. Yeah.
So
There it is. Oh.
Yep, here's the coverage of Diane. And in this newspaper clipping, classmates and others from the time have identified that person at the far right as being Lance Voss.
Yeah, his elbow sticking out there.
Yep, this picture was believed to be taken less than 30 minutes after the body was found.
Mm-hmm. And he was there, checking it out.
Yep. So, Voss was among 700 young men who were interviewed as suspects in the disappearance and murder of Diane by 1963. So the Chicago Police Department would later say that he was among 3 who were serious suspects. In 64, Before graduating, Voss stopped attending Austin High School in 65. So he never graduated from high school.
Yeah, he flunked out. Now, the Snake River
No,
podcast points out, right? That
no, I don't think we're entirely sure.
oh, okay.
I actually think that no one's been able to get the education records. And
Okay.
that's actually the really bizarre thing about it. Why would you leave before your senior year?
Right. Oh.
So
Oh
why
yeah.
did he abruptly leave in the school year afterwards? I think that is people love to get those education records. So in
Yeah.
65, before he was old enough to enlist in the Navy, he enlisted in the Navy. He focused on cryptology and signals. So signals intelligence, that's intercepting electronic messages. Cryptology is code making and code breaking. His interest in code making, code breaking kind of becomes relevant as people start to look into these classified ads and other puzzles that seem to be buried in some of his writing. So in 68, he's discharged, starts going to school at a community college in California in the Alameda area. And on June 4th, 1972, a security guard in Santa Cruz, California, was approached by a young couple who had told them that they had found a body at a beach. 17-year-old Antoinette Anino was believed to have died at midnight, according to the coroner. She had come out to the boardwalk that night with her boyfriend and his girlfriend. The two couples split, and Anino spoke with her boyfriend at a wharf. They had an argument, and they split up. She didn't show up. The group searched for her. The coroner believed she had washed up, accidental drowning, and ruled it a suicide. The next night, Voss was arrested for attempting to break into the funeral home where Anino's body was located. The police report said that Voss was seen trying to enter the rear of the Willow Glen Chapel, where Antoinette was the only body present. The officer saw Voss walking from the back of the building with a flashlight in his coat pocket, a 12-inch knife on his hip, and a camera. The officer found that at the back of the chapel from where Voss was coming from, a screen had been removed from a window. So Voss told the police that he was going into the chapel to visit his girlfriend who had died one more time. And like I said, the only body in the chapel was that teenage girl, Antoinette Anina. He was charged with burglary, pled to trespass, gave a false address to them. And, I think this might be, yeah. It's so unbelievably strange. This might be a good place for us to stop for the night and pick up with the rest of it.
Oh, I agree.
But
Yeah.
I do want to share one thing as a bit of a preview for what's to come.
Yeah.
This is one of my finds after I came back from Idaho. I haven't done a lot, but I found this classified ad that Voss posted. And in it, it says, and you can see how odd it is, personal, interpersonal counseling. And that's what caught my attention. I found it by phone number. But what really, really caught my attention is, why would you use personal and interpersonal when describing counseling? It could be personal counseling, interpersonal counseling, whatever it is, but why both? And Mr. Dave Vander Does offers personal counseling. We're saying personal again. You're paying by the word. It's classified the ad. Why are you repeating personal? Why are you even saying personal? Why are you saying interpersonal?
Yeah.
Counseling, right? Spelled wrong with 2 L's, right? For people of all ages with an accent on Christian living emphasis. Why not say of all ages, or why not say offers Christian counseling for people of all ages, period?
Yeah.
Why the accent
on Christian living emphasis.
And emphasis, right? No need. Okay. Individuals or groups. All right. Cool. Got all that.
And 2 phone numbers again.
Yeah, 2 phone numbers again. It was all very weird. And so I called Gloria Crow Boberts. And she was like, oh, yeah, no, he's got a friend. His friend is named Vander Does. And Allison, you'll get this. I went and I looked in the classifieds from the days before and the days after and found a version of this classified ad where Dave's name is spelled correctly. Vander space does. Counseling is spelled correctly.
Oh.
So someone called in and got the ad changed so it was incorrect, and it ran for 8 days after that.
He ran this
ready for it?
after?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So if you, without stepping over one letter, without using one letter twice, you've got the names of Steve Parasol. You've got the full name of Christina White in blue, Steve Parasol in Lovell. You have the last name Miller in purple. You've got Nelson highlighted in pink, and you've got David highlighted in orange.
The names of all of his victims are encoded.
Well, I mean, like, I'm not convicting him quite yet, but
it's really, and you did some math on this, yeah?
Yeah. So it was very interesting. So a little mathematician friend of mine said that if you were to take all what was it? If you were to take all, you could look at it two different ways. You could take all 27 letters and just randomly select them. What would the odds of all of those names being in there? And it's like more than 1 in 100 billion odds randomly selected. However, if you weigh letters for their frequency and how they're used in the English language, you're talking 1 in 900 billion chances.
Yeah. And this is yet again, and he placed this ad right after the murder, or after Antoinette. No. I'm sorry. No. I'm missing the timeline. When was this ad?
After the Lewiston Civic Theatre.
Okay. Oh my goodness.
So I just wanted to give people that preview for next time because Lance is really an interesting guy. So
yeah. And, he, like you said, he studied cryptology. He studied code breaking. He loves these kind of puzzly things. He's also a drama man, a theater man. He likes a rousing story. He likes to play the bad guy in stories. There's so much to this guy's personality and so much to what he has done or what he's been linked to.
I fell over when I saw this, without using any two letters twice in a 25-word ad, you can find Steve Parasol, Miller, Nelson, David, and Christina White, right?
Yeah.
The last names of the 3 victims whose bodies were found and the full names of the 2 that are missing. What are the odds of that in a misspelled ad with words it doesn't need?
He calls in to have the ad spelling changed so he can fit this code in there.
Right. And
wild.
And so remember, the first day the ad runs, Vander Does is spelled as one word. Counseling is spelled correctly, and then it has the 2 L's. So the other thing that's really interesting for me is, so you've got 8 days of the ad running, and what do you have 7 of for the ad that ran? Steve, Parasol, Miller, Nelson, David, Christine. 7 names. Yeah.
Seven name. Oh my gosh.
So anyway, I found it very, very fascinating. And Kathy has done amazing research on it. She's the one, there's another ad that she found that's amazing, that probably relates to Christina White. But anyway, we will be back. And,
we have much more to discuss.
Thanks for joining us for this second episode on the disappearance of Christina White and the Lewis Clark Valley serial killer. Next week, we'll be back on Tuesday with one of our regular episodes, an interview, and we'll be back on Friday with the third episode in this series. In the meantime, if you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations like this one with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/the Silver Linings Handbook.